What happens when a midnight strike in the Gulf ripples all the way to the heart of Africa? At 3:47 Doha time, the roar of Israeli F-35 jets tore across Qatar's sky. Precision missiles slammed into a communications hub, shaking the capital awake. Windows shattered, children cried. Smoke billowed over a city that just hours earlier had been asleep in peace. Israel called it counterterrorism, a preemptive strike. But the truth was simpler. A sovereign nation had been attacked without warning. Now imagine being in Ouagadougou, 1,000 miles away, turning on the radio to hear that headline. For many Africans, it was not just Qatar under fire. It was a memory of their own homes, their own streets, their own families caught in wars they did not start. And in that moment, one young leader decided silence was no longer an option. Captain Ibrahim Traoré picked up the phone and called Benjamin Netanyahu directly. "Your aircraft crossed a line," he told him. "Africa will not stay silent." It was not a threat shouted in anger, but a calm declaration that would set off a chain reaction across continents. Within hours, African capitals lit up with emergency meetings. Within a day, defense contractors in Tel Aviv were calculating billions in potential losses. For the first time, Israel learned that the world pays attention when Africa speaks in unison. This story is important to you, even if you are far away in Chicago, Dallas, or Miami. Because if powerful countries can attack Qatar without consequence today, what's to prevent them from involving America's sons and daughters in another protracted war in the future? What if the next headline you read is not about Doha or Ouagadougou, but about Washington itself? Stay with me, because in the next few minutes you will see how a little-known president in Africa forced Israel and its Western backers to confront something they never expected. Africa's fury and Africa's power. Within 6 hours of that phone call, African presidents were already coordinating statements. Within 12 hours, Netanyahu's office was scrambling to reach the African Union, and within 24 hours, Israeli defense contractors were in full panic, fearing the collapse of billion-dollar partnerships across the continent. Yet what unfolded next was not just about contracts or diplomacy. It was about self-respect. For the first time in many years, Africa was not just observing someone else's conflict from the sidelines. It was actively influencing the outcome. And what followed would shake Tel Aviv more than the strike itself. The image of Israeli jets streaking across Qatar's night sky spread like wildfire across African airwaves. Radios buzzed in crowded marketplaces. Television anchors spoke in urgent tones, and WhatsApp groups filled with grainy images of Doha's skyline under fire. For most of the world, it was another Middle Eastern headline. But for Africa, it was personal. The continent has lived through decades of airstrikes justified as counterterrorism. Invasions defended as humanitarian and resource grabs framed as partnerships. Every bomb that fell on Doha echoed the long history of foreign powers treating sovereignty as optional. In Ouagadougou, an elderly miner named Adama, age 67, was awakened before sunrise by the sound of his old radio. He had spent his entire life working in the gold mines north of the city, with hands calloused from years of hard work and lungs damaged by dust. When the news anchor announced that Israel had attacked Qatar, Adama quietly said to his wife, "Today they challenge Qatar. Tomorrow they will challenge us." For him, Traoré's voice later that morning was not just politics, it was survival. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's response was swift. He did not couch his words in diplomatic caution. He did not wait for Europe or Washington to set the tone. Instead, he stood before the cameras and fatigues, eyes steady, and declared, "No nation targets another nation's capital and expects African silence." It was a sentence that reverberated across living rooms, mosques, churches, and crowded bus stations. It was also the moment when a continent that had too often spoken in whispers began to speak in a roar. Netanyahu, who was used to receiving quick support from Washington and subdued responses from smaller countries, suddenly faced an unforeseen issue: Africa's anger. Defense planners in Tel Aviv initially disregarded Burkina Faso as an impoverished, landlocked nation with minimal influence. But within hours, Traoré proved them wrong. Burkina Faso suspended military cooperation with Israel, canceled training programs, and terminated intelligence sharing. The Israeli ambassador requested an urgent audience, insisting it was a misunderstanding. Traoré's reply was sharp. The only misunderstanding is Israel thinking Africa will remain silent when sovereignty is trampled. In Accra, Ghana's parliament erupted in debate as members called for suspension of Israeli contracts. In Abuja, Nigeria's president refused Netanyahu's call outright, signaling that this was not merely Burkina Faso's stand, but Africa's. Across the continent, ordinary people felt a sense of dignity they had not experienced in years. In Bamako, young men painted slogans on walls, "Africa bows to no one." In Johannesburg, pensioners phoned into late-night radio shows, recalling how apartheid had once survived only because the world remained silent, and declaring that silence would no longer define Africa's place in global politics. For Netanyahu, the true shock was not in the canceled deals, but in the symbolism. Africa, long treated as a stage for external powers, was now writing its own script. The traditional script would have been predictable. Israel apologizes. Washington applies pressure. African governments back down quietly. But Traoré tore that script apart. He demonstrated that even a nation struggling with instability and poverty could wield moral authority when it acted bravely. This situation was like an old tale, a fight between David and Goliath. But in this case, David wasn't a single boy with a slingshot. David was an entire continent united by history and bound by a common desire for dignity. And Goliath was not only Israel, but also the complacency of powers who assumed Africa would remain a silent audience. Yet even as the rhetoric grew fiery, there was something deeper unfolding, fear mingling with pride. Adama, the old miner, told his grandson, "Be proud your president spoke, but be ready." They killed Lumumba. They killed Sankara. They killed Gaddafi. They may try to kill him, too. That sentence captured the heartbeat of Africa's reaction. Hope for freedom tempered by the memory of martyrs. Traoré's defiance motivated millions. Yet it also set him on the same perilous course that had taken the lives of Africa's most visionary leaders. International analysts quickly appeared on television screens. Some labeled Traoré as irresponsible, forecasting that Burkina Faso would become isolated and suffer an economic collapse. Others called him a revolutionary, comparing his words to Thomas Sankara's speeches on sovereignty, but none could ignore him. For the first time in decades, Israel faced coordinated African condemnation, and the United States was forced to scramble behind the scenes, not to lead, but to contain the fallout. By the third day, demonstrations had spread from Cairo to Cape Town. Protesters waved both Qatari and African flags. Chants rose in dozens of languages, but carried the same message: our land, our right, our future. African social media amplified the story until it reached diaspora communities in London, Paris, and New York. In Harlem, African-American activists invoked Martin Luther King Jr.'s words about justice rolling down like waters, linking their own struggle to Africa's new defiance. And yet, beneath the celebrations, a question lingered. Would Africa's unity hold? Would leaders resist the pressure already building from Washington and Brussels? History had taught Africans to expect betrayal from within as much as from without. Still, for the moment, Africa had spoken with a single voice, and Netanyahu's government was left stunned. As one Israeli analyst admitted on live television, "We underestimated them. We never thought Africa would matter this much." Why did Ibrahim Traoré react so strongly when Qatar was attacked? The reason is found not just in international relations, but also in historical memory, loyalty, and a principle that predates modern political boundaries. For Africans, sovereignty is not just a theoretical term in official documents. It is a painful memory. It is the memory of Lumumba's body hidden in acid, of Sankara's blood staining the streets of Ouagadougou, of Gaddafi dragged through the dirt. It is the reminder that when foreign powers decide your fate, your people pay the price in blood. For Traoré, Qatar was not just another Gulf state. Qatar was a partner that invested in Burkina Faso when others looked away. Its sovereign wealth funds financed hospitals in the Sahel. Its companies built roads that connected forgotten villages. Qatari scholarships opened doors for young Africans to study abroad. And while Western aid often came with strings attached, lectures and monitoring, Qatar's method had been distinct, respectful, practical, and based on the concept of shared advantage. When a friend like that is attacked, staying silent is a betrayal. That is why Traoré instructed his cabinet at Forest, Mim, prepare our most forceful condemnation. Africa speaks today. His words revealed a truth too many global leaders ignored, that Africa's silence was never consent, only endurance, and that endurance had reached its breaking point. The political and moral framing became clear. Where Washington expressed concern, Traoré expressed condemnation. Where Europe called for restraint, Burkina Faso called for consequences. The difference was not in vocabulary, it was in courage. Africa, often dismissed as a follower in global affairs, was now taking the lead. Critics argued that Burkina Faso's action was reckless. How could a small landlocked nation dare to oppose Israel, a nuclear-armed country supported by Washington? Yet this is where the truth is revealed. In the 21st century, power isn't solely determined by bombs and missiles. It is about legitimacy, about votes at the United Nations, about markets and minerals, about the moral authority to say no when the strong trample the weak. Israel had miscalculated by assuming Africa was still a continent of quiet bystanders. Traoré's condemnation proved otherwise. The reaction spread like a drum beat. Within 48 hours, 15 African leaders issued similar statements. Within 72 hours, African ambassadors were recalled from Tel Aviv. South Africa suspended relations. Algeria closed its airspace. Morocco canceled agricultural deals. Nigeria terminated defense contracts. This was not orchestrated by Washington or Paris. It was driven by anger, by principles, and by the collective belief that sovereignty was more important than alliances founded on intimidation. And for everyday Africans, the symbolism was powerful. In Ouagadougou, students gathered outside the university gates holding handwritten signs. Qatar today, Africa tomorrow. In Lagos, taxi drivers tuned their radios to call-in shows, demanding their leaders follow Traoré's example. In Nairobi, women's groups marched with banners reading, "Sovereignty is sacred." For the first time in years, Africa was united not by tragedy, but by defiance. The deeper question lingered. Was this only about Israel and Qatar, or was it about something larger? The answer revealed in every African response was clear. It was about establishing a new rule in global politics. Sovereignty is non-negotiable. If Russia could not rewrite Ukraine's borders without consequences, if America could not bomb Iraq without scars, then Israel could not strike Qatar without paying a price. Africa's voice turned what could have been just another headline into a global reckoning. Fear mingled with pride. Families remembered the assassinations of African heroes who had stood against foreign powers. They whispered, "Will Traoré be next?" That fear gave the defiance more weight. It served as a reminder to people that in Africa, bravery often has a price. But the sense of pride was stronger than the fear. For a change, Africa was not begging for acknowledgement. It was insisting on respect. The moral lines were drawn. Israel claimed self-defense. But how does one defend by bombing a sovereign neighbor without provocation? The United States said Burkina Faso's condemnation was destabilizing. But who destabilized the region first? Europe asked for balance. But how do you balance the scales when one side holds F-35s and the other holds nothing but sovereignty? Traoré's answer was blunt. Words without action are powerless. If sovereignty is not defended today, it will be erased tomorrow. Africa had long been told its role was to follow, to assist, to accept. But in this moment, it declared itself a leader, and that declaration terrified those who profited from its silence. By the fourth day, newspapers in Washington and Paris carried headlines not about Qatar, but about Africa. Analysts called it the African awakening. Diplomats called it the unexpected front. Citizens called it what it was: dignity. And yet, as powerful as the condemnation was, another question began to surface. Could Africa's unity survive the economic and political pressure that was certain to follow? Would leaders withstand the demands, the intimidation, and the allure of aid and business deals? Or would the past repeat itself, as it often has, with courageous starts that end in betrayal? That unresolved question became the suspenseful element not just for Netanyahu, but for Africa as well. The first ripples of Africa's defiance shook Tel Aviv. But the tidal wave came days later, and it was bigger than anyone imagined. What began as a single phone call from Ibrahim Traoré turned into a continental movement that even Israel's closest allies could not contain. On the fifth day after the Qatar strike, the African Union convened an emergency summit in Addis Ababa. Delegates arrived in a flurry, some flying overnight, others driving through dangerous roads to make their presence known. In the Great Marble Hall, leaders from across 54 nations sat under the emblem of a golden map of Africa. The atmosphere was dense with anticipation and murmurs of history in the making. One by one, heads of state stood up to address the assembly. Some recounted years of being treated with disrespect by more powerful nations. Others reminded the audience of assassinated heroes, of promises broken, of sovereignty denied. And when Trey finally stepped to the podium, the room fell silent. He was the youngest leader in the hall, barely past 30, wearing no expensive suit, but his military fatigues. He looked more like a soldier than a statesman, and perhaps that was why his words carried such weight. Africa is no longer the background of other people's wars. He said, "From this day, we are the front line of sovereignty." Applause erupted, not the polite claps of protocol, but the thunderous roar of men and women who had longed to hear such conviction. For the first time since the colonial era, the African Union unanimously voted to impose sanctions on Israel, which included suspending diplomatic immunities, canceling defense agreements, and calling for accountability at the United Nations. The surprising element wasn't just the choice itself, but how quickly it was made. Typically, resolutions of this nature would take months to pass and would be weakened by bureaucratic processes. This time it took hours. Leaders who had once hesitated now stood shoulder to shoulder. Even nations that had cultivated quiet ties with Tel Aviv voted in favor. Israel's isolation was complete. Netanyahu, shocked by the unanimity, attempted damage control. His aides reached out to Ghana, to Nigeria, to Kenya, countries that had been reliable partners, but the calls were refused. In ARA, the president's office released a TUR statement. "We stand with Africa." In Abuja, aides leaked that Netanyahu's number was blocked. In Nairobi, the Kenyan leader listened for just 30 seconds before returning the phone to his secretary and leaving the room. In a symbolic sense, this was a major blow. Israel hadn't just lost business agreements, it had lost credibility. The economic fallout began almost immediately. Israeli defense firms, long dependent on African contracts for surveillance systems, drone technology, and training programs, saw billions wiped from their balance sheets. Mining deals in West Africa were frozen. Agricultural projects in North Africa were suspended. Investors panicked. Stock prices in Tel Aviv dipped as analysts admitted, "We underestimated Africa's weight." For decades, Africa had been treated as a bargaining chip. Now it was the player flipping the table. The shock waves reached ordinary people too. In Johannesburg, newspapers ran headlines, "Africa stands." In Dar, children painted Traoré's face on school walls. In Bamako, market women spoke of him as our Sankara reborn. In Cairo, university students compared him to JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. Voices of courage rising against overwhelming odds. For many, Traoré was no longer just the leader of Burkina Faso. He had become the symbol of a new Africa. But symbols come with danger. In Washington, State Department cables described him as a destabilizing populist. European analysts called him a radical nationalist. Intelligence reports discussed possible threats to his life, reminding African audiences of how leaders who challenge global powers often met with unfortunate fates. In the streets of Ouagadougou, People whispered anxiously, will they attempt to assassinate him as well? This fear, rather than quieting the people, actually strengthened their allegiance. Crowds gathered nightly outside the presidential palace, holding candles and chanting prayers. They were not just protecting a president, they were guarding an idea. Meanwhile, Israel scrambled for allies. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant flew to Cairo, Abuja, and Nairobi, pleading for reconsideration, but he was denied meetings. Airport officials refused him protocol privileges. At one point, cameras captured him standing awkwardly at a security checkpoint like an ordinary traveler, a humiliation that went viral across African social media. The message was clear. No amount of military hardware could erase the insult of violated sovereignty. And then came the most stunning development. The Arab League, emboldened by Africa's stand, invited Traoré to address its emergency session. It was unprecedented. A young captain from landlocked Burkina Faso speaking before kings and presidents of the Middle East. As he walked to the podium in Cairo, the hall erupted in applause. Qatar stood with Africa when no one else would, he declared, and now Africa stands with Qatar. Sovereignty is not a gift from the powerful. It is the natural right of every country. His speech was broadcast live from Cairo to Casablanca and from Riyadh to Rabat. Millions of people watched, many with tears in their eyes. This was the twist that shook not only Tel Aviv, but also Washington. Africa was no longer a passive recipient of aid or a pawn in geopolitics. It was now a voice leading the global South. The symbolic power of this shift was immense. For decades, the narrative had been written elsewhere. Paris, London, Washington, Tel Aviv. Now Africa was writing its own narrative, and the world was forced to listen. Back in Ouagadougou, Adama, the old miner, listened on his radio as Traoré's speech echoed through crackling frequencies. He turned to his grandson and said, "When I was your age, we whispered the names of Lumumba and Sankara. Today you shout the name of Traoré. Remember this day. History will remember it too." His words captured the generational shift, a passing of the torch from whispered dreams to shouted defiance. For Netanyahu, the cost was clear. Israel had intended the strike on Qatar as a show of strength, a message of deterrence. Instead, it revealed weakness. It all started with a whisper from Brussels. A leak so small it could have been dismissed, but the words inside carry the weight of an economic bombshell. Behind closed doors, Donald Trump, standing before NATO allies, delivered a chilling demand. Raise tariffs on Africa, make them bend or watch them starve. The target was clear. Africa's raw lifeblood. Oil and gold, two resources without which Western economies would stumble overnight. Trump feared that if BRICS locked these resources, Washington's grip on the global order would shatter. For Africa, the message was brutal. Either surrender sovereignty or face economic suffocation. But in Ouagadougou, the reaction was very different. Captain Ibrahim didn't tremble. He identified it for what it was: economic hostility presented as diplomacy. Instead of remaining quiet, he readied a response. What unfolded next would rattle Africa, NATO, and the entire world. The leak was never random. It came from inside the very room where the decision was made. During a closed-door meeting in Brussels, Washington pressed its allies hard, raised tariffs on Africa, cut them off until they returned to dependence. The message was blunt and the targets were clear. Africa's oil and gold, the lifeblood of entire economies, the twin resources without which Western industries would stumble overnight. Most European leaders stayed silent, but not all. Among them sat one who couldn't bury his conscience. He understood the implications of such an action. It was economic warfare presented as diplomacy. A fresh round of hardship would be inflicted upon millions. Yet speaking out publicly would have been political suicide. So a different choice was made. Late that night, a single page from the classified memo slipped quietly into the hands of an anonymous European journalist. Not through official channels, not for power, but as an act of quiet resistance. The journalist's report was short but explosive. Washington had pushed Europe to secretly prepare tariffs designed to choke Africa's oil and gold exports, forcing the continent to kneel in Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré didn't see it as rumor. He saw it for what it was, a declaration of war on Africa's dignity. The news spread rapidly. Within hours, rumors of the leaked document were circulating through African capitals. Local news outlets ran headlines like, "Europe targets Africa's oil and gold." On social media, young voices asked the same question. How long will we let them dictate our future? In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré wasted no time. He summoned his advisors before dawn. The mood was tense but steady. "This isn't about tariffs," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is about control. They want our oil, our gold, and our sovereignty. If we bow today, we'll be slaves tomorrow." By mid-morning, emergency calls went out across the Sahel, Mali, Guinea, and beyond. Traoré called for a meeting not of diplomats, but of leaders who grasped the gravity of the situation. Within a few days, a private summit was in progress. It was held not in Paris or Geneva, but in the center of West Africa. Behind heavy doors, the air was thick with defiance. Each leader spoke of the same pattern: gold siphoned out through shadow contracts, oil fields dominated by foreign firms, revenues disappearing overseas, while villages remained in poverty. For the first time in decades, the conversation shifted. It was no longer about begging for aid. It was about standing together. And Traoré set the tone. "If they dare impose tariffs, then we will dare something greater. We will shut down the flow of oil and gold to their markets, and we will find new partners who respect us." The room fell silent. Then one by one, leaders nodded. The decision was risky, dangerous even. But in that moment, Africa's divided voices started to unite into a single, firm response. News of the summit's decision leaked quickly, not through official communiques, but through the voices of ordinary people. Radio stations carried fragments of speeches, and soon the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey were alive with chants. "If they want our oil and gold, they'll have to take our dignity too." Markets buzzed with tension. Merchants whispered about the possibility of higher prices, about shortages that might come if Europe really raised tariffs. Farmers in dusty villages asked whether their harvest would still find buyers. Mothers worried about school fees, about medicine, about the thin line between survival and hunger. But another feeling, pride, burned beneath the anxiety. For decades, Africans had seen their oil extracted and their gold taken away. All the while, they were instructed to be thankful for loans and assistance. Now, for the first time, their leaders were daring to say no. In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, a young student held a sign that read, "Better to endure hunger for a year than slavery for a century." The crowd roared in agreement. Traoré understood the cost. He knew that freezing exports would tighten belts across the continent. Yet when he appeared on national television, his words resonated deeper than any promise of comfort. "We may suffer in the short term, but suffering with dignity is better than living forever on our knees." And in that moment, something remarkable happened. People who once felt powerless started to view themselves as participants in a larger cause. The whisper transformed into a unified chant. "Stand firm, we support you." The shock inside Europe was immediate and undeniable. Markets that had long considered African resources as background noise suddenly realized they were staring into an abyss. In Frankfurt, traders watched gold prices climb like a rocket, their screens flashing red with each uptick. In Paris, energy planners quietly admitted that more than half of the uranium powering France's nuclear grid came from Niger, a lifeline now under question. And in Milan, executives from Europe's electric car industry gathered in a panic without cobalt and lithium from the Congo. Their factories would stall, their green revolution collapsing before it could even take root. But the most dangerous pressure point of all was oil and gold. African oil drawn from wells in the Sahel